I'm speaking with Professor Tom Sito, author of Drawing the Line, The Untold Story of the Animation Unions from Bosco to Bart Simpson. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
So first, can you tell me how you, tell me about your prodigious animation career and also how you ended up writing this book?
Well, I started in animation about 40 years ago, and I was a regular professional in the Hollywood Studios, so I spent a lot of time working at the Walt Disney Studio, Warner Brothers, Hanna-Barbera, Fox, all of them. And I was kind of fortunate enough that when I began my career in the 70s, a lot of Golden Age artists who had, done their best work in the 30s and 40s were at the time of their retirement. So we had a chance to overlap a little bit. So, like any old soldiers, sitting around a campfire, you would swap stories with one another. And you'd hear these wonderful stories about, Hollywood back in the day. And, you'd sit, with a beer, and some of these old guys would go, someday somebody should put this stuff in a book. Like, oh, okay. And one of the things that struck me was that a lot of people who went through the Disney strike in 1941, even in their old age, were mad at one another. They still were angry at one another, And I thought, wow, this thing happened like over almost 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. These people are in their 80s, they're facing the end of their lives, and they still harbor this rancor. And I thought, what created this kind of passion? Because when you read the official studio of Hollywood histories, it's almost like, oh, Walt had a wonderful family, and then a couple of Reds tried to spoil the fun, and then World War II happened. Mm-hmm. It's like, wait a minute, for the people who went through it, it was the most important thing in their lives, yet nobody's talking about it. Mm-hmm. So I decided to, tell their side of the story. Okay.
Well, now let's talk about the book. How do you break it down, and what do you focus on?
Well, I'm particularly focused on the animation artists, the animation industry. I mean, animation is kind of funny in that it's kind of an industrialized art form. A regular, painter or something can sit in a garret with a brush and make, and make masterpieces. Crazy Van Gogh would run out in the field with his canvas and make, works of genius. Animation requires crews. It's an industrialized art form. You need a staff of like dozens, if not hundreds, of people to make a really good movie. And one of the reasons why Hollywood kind of stepped to the fore, including Hollywood animation in the silent era, was that while other parts of the world there'd be sort of ateliers of small filmmakers and all, Hollywood industrialized the process. We turned it into dream factories where people clocked in and clocked out. Mm-hmm. And like any kind of industrialized system, eventually the worker bees will start to feel like they're being taken advantage of, and they want to seek to collectively bargain. And this was the case throughout the 30s. Another thing I found was that a lot of people who would write specifically Disney or animation history would tend to divorce the studio from the rest of Hollywood and treat it like they're like the Never Land, some sort of bubble. Mm-hmm. When you talk to the artists who were there, after work they would go to a bar or a club or a dance and talk to their friends at the other studios. And in the late 30s, early 40s, everybody was talking about industrialization and unionization. And the studio heads were reacting much like the people in charge of other companies like General Motors or RCA or something like that. They were fighting back and resisting any kind of unionization. Mm-hmm. So it was that tug of war, basically from about 1935, when the Roosevelt administration signed the Wagner Act, saying all working Americans have the right to collective bargaining. Hollywood more or less completely organized by about the end of 1941. Like by the end of just at the dawn of World War II, mm-hmm. That's when most of the backstage of Hollywood, organized, and the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild, and and the Animation Guilds.
Mm-hmm. So, but the book does cover from that period to modern day, more or less.
Yeah. Basically, it's like that middle period. That was like sort of the golden age when the sort of these large works of Hollywood film was being done. But I also have to take in the period in the 1960s when the movie studios yielded more to television and to more lower budget stuff, and then of course outsourcing and globalization, and then the Hollywood blacklist, and then finally the digital revolution, because in the 1990s everything changed, because before 1990 if you made an animated film, you were using pencils and paper and paint and celluloids, acetate sheets. And by 2000, everything was digital. Like everybody's using, tablets and styluses, and everything is now digital. I think it was like just last year, earlier this spring, the company Cartoon Color, which was the main company that made animation paint, announced that they were suspending production because nobody uses this stuff anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
So do you focus solely on U.S. studios, or do you get into any foreign studios?
Mostly I focus on U.S. studios. I think I talk a little bit about the overseas studios, but the problem was like there's a very healthy animation industry in France and a very healthy animation industry in Japan, and they have their own unions and their own there's a British union as well. So they went through their own thing, but I tend to really just to focus on America for now.
Mm-hmm. So, considering the span of time, can someone see certain pieces of animation that look different than before because of union action, because of people being switched out or processes being changed or anything like that?
I think the big change that people can see is that a lot of these strike leaders in the Disney strike of 1941 were driven out by Disney after the strike. They got together and formed their own company called United Productions of America, or UPA. Mm-hmm. And UPA, besides being a rival studio, presented a stylistic change and challenge as well, mm-hmm. which is that Walt Disney had basically, made animation push more towards realism, more realistic-looking action. So water looks like water, and smoke looks like smoke, and there's acting and performance, and try to be as realistic as possible. Kind of culminating in Bambi, which was a very, very realistic-looking film for the time period. A lot of the artists working there challenged that notion, much like the way the Impressionists, challenged the art in the 19th century, and say, who says the natural end of everything should be realism? Why can't we be more mannerly and stylized? And UPA began doing a more graphic sort of style that a lot of artists sort of leaned towards. They were influenced by modern masters like Mondrian and Mirbeau, and the Mexican muralists like Diego Rivera and Sigueros. And so a lot of the artists in the 1940s sort of gravitated towards that, and that was kind of an exciting movement. Disney never really liked that style very much. One of his artists, Ward Kimball, created a film called To Whistle, Plunk and Boom, which was in that sort of very graphic, 1950s style. And Disney actually was out of the country on a promotional thing while the film was being completed. And the legend is, when he came back his first day at the studio, he went into the theater to see the week's dailies, and the rough cut came up without any credit. And he watched the whole thing, and then he looked at Ward Kimball, the director, and said, "Aren't you glad we don't do crap like that?" Well, surprise! Then the film won an Oscar, so he was like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah.
But his taste really went towards the older, rounder, like sort of like more a traditional storytelling kind of look. And the UPA style wound up being the big influence, on graphics and all in the 1950s and then the 60s. So, today we kind of make fun of it, or lampoon that style with things like Samurai Jack and Dexter's Lab and things like that. That's done like almost an homage to that kind of 50s graphic look.
Mm-hmm. Which, how many different studios would you say you touch on in this book?
A bunch. Let's see. So yeah, I talk about Fleischer. I talk about John Randolph Bray. Bray was the first guy in the silent era to really sort of define what we call the production pipeline, which creating job classifications that later became careers for people. Terry Toons, I talk about UPA, I talk about Disney, Hanna-Barbera, so I feel like about a dozen studios.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you say the book is more, say, labor history with, that's about the animation, or is it more animation history and it talks about how labor influenced, if that question makes sense?
Yeah. I'd say it's kind of animation history, but also how labor influenced, the creation of animation, because it's a kind of a thing that people kind of discount. They don't really talk about, the political activity or and the labor activity of a lot of their favorite artists. Like Chuck Jones, the great Bugs Bunny animator, was very pro-union. Also Bill Melendez, who directed A Charlie Brown Christmas, was very pro-union. And it's funny because once I started delving into this background, you start to see that sort of back door of Hollywood that's not talked about, because most of the media is corporate media, and they don't like to talk about things like workers' rights and stuff. So you find out things like Joan Crawford was a vice president of the Screen Actors Guild, and Boris Karloff and Groucho Marx were very pro-union. Jimmy Cagney was very pro-union. It's a kind of thing that's like it's never really kind of discussed, except in the side. So I thought that it was time to really do a focus on this sort of on this portion of their lives that's not often talked about.
Would you and this is a generalization, of course, but since animators, I would think, are more of a sort of a intellectual, creative bunch compared to, say, people might think a stereotypical person in a union is, a manual laborer. Would you say there was a different approach to unionization among animators in any way?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, because animation folks think of themselves as artists, who are working, in fact, and in the 1940s it was even more so, because a lot of the artists in the golden age didn't train to become animators. Animators was a career you kind of fell into. They trained to become, formal artists, and then wound up, embracing this funny little career. Early in the 1920s, there were a number of Disney artists who wouldn't be photographed in front of the studio because they didn't want it to get back to their parents, who said, "We spent all this money on art school for you, and you got a job in a flicker company?"
Oh, boy.
Yeah. So likewise with unionization, it becomes difficult. But then you think that, symphony orchestras are unionized, ballet troupes are unionized, Broadway dancers are unionized. There is a way to approach it. Writers. I mean, can you think of a more, individual or libertarian, in the small L, sort of profession as being a writer, but yet, the Writers Guild is a very strong guild here in town.
Mm-hmm. Before I turn towards how you did your research, are there any other issues in the book you brought up that you haven't mentioned yet that you might want to? When
it comes to Disney history in particular, some people have a very strong connection to the Disney Corporation as a social sort of ideal, and I mean, I can understand that because I myself was a Disney animator on a lot of famous movies like Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and I always found it funny that how there's a spirit or there's a reputation to the company that the other companies don't have. Like nobody cares if Universal is irreverent, or nobody cares if Paramount is iconoclastic. But Disney is Disney. It's a certain thing. And there's always going to be some people who just hate if you make Walt Disney anything less than Mother Teresa. And Disney was I talked to a lot of people who interacted with Walt Disney personally, and they said he was just a man. He liked to smoke, he liked to drink after work. He was a regular guy, but he created this image for himself as Uncle Walt, the friendly, everybody's favorite, friendly father figure. And the studio used to call that the franchise, meaning that, when you think of a facial tissue, your mind instantly goes Kleenex. And when you think of a photocopy, your mind instantly goes Xerox. And when you think quality family entertainment, your mind goes Disney. And he said that's a very, it took decades to build that reputation. So, I don't want people to come away with the idea that this book is just, assaulting that reputation or throwing mud at Disney. Like, there have been books that are just out and out hatchet jobs where they're just trying to focus on the negative. I kind of treated the whole conflict in 1941 as almost like sort of a Greek tragedy. That, like, if everybody stuck to their convictions, this inevitable bad result was bound to happen. And I think Disney was a good man who just got he kind of like went down a bad path at that time period. He was turning 40 and his mother just died. And all the success that he had initially on some of his movies had kind of, turned for the worst at that point. And then suddenly his artists are demanding a union. So I think he kind of lashed out emotionally, that in a way that, he might have regretted later.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm a big Disney fan, and I love Disney history, and I admire what Disney has done for entertainment and education.
Yeah.
But, I'm not afraid to see that kind of stuff,
Yeah. I mean, one of my mentors was an old animator named James Culhane, who did a lot of animated a lot of the Seven Dwarfs in the High Ho March, the little song. And, he also did a lot of work on Donald Duck. And he told me, when he was an old man, he said, Walt Disney is a great man. Walt Disney was a genius. He goes, if he liked you, he was a warm friend. If you crossed him, he was a mean son of a bitch. And when he died, he left no competitors. There was nobody anywhere near what Disney was doing at the time of his death.
So let me ask you what you used, what resources you used to write the book. You mentioned interviews, and what else did you gather for this? Yeah. A lot of it had to be first-person interview because very, very little was written down about it. I also used the Screen Cartoonist Guild. The Hollywood Cartoonist Guild has an archives at Cal State University Northridge. Also, UCLA Film Archives, they have a very extensive archives, including a lot of unpublished memoirs of some of the labor organizers. And Dave Fleischer, Max Fleischer's brother, who was a top director and the development executive at Fleischer Studios. There was some unpublished manuscripts of their recollections. And you have to do a certain amount of digging because there's not a lot there specifically about labor history. And like I said, I was fortunate enough that I knew a lot of the strike leaders personally, so I could kind of get there. And I was good friends with Roy Disney, so I mean, I know the Disney family very well. And I sent them a copy of the book; they liked it, so which helps. Yeah, definitely. So, I want to ask, so how many interviews did you end up doing, would you say?
Oh, I'd say probably about 75.
Wow.
Yeah. You know, it took me about 7 years to write the book, but, you know, also, you know, you got to make a living, too, so.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I imagine.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I'm sure the way publishers are, you know, all that information you collected didn't make it in the book, so you must have it in an awesome just notebook of cool information that, you know.
Thank you. Yeah. What's funny is that when I first had the manuscript in, when my publisher read it, they wrote me back to go, "This really happened?" They go, "Yeah, it really did." Mm-hmm. The mob was involved in the Communist Party, and you know, there was all kinds of stuff. I mean, you know, labor history in the 30s and 40s was a pretty wild, you know, period. I mean, what's amazing about the Disney strike was that it was one of the few strikes without violence. Mm-hmm. I mean, back in those days, you know, the General Motors strike or whatever. I mean, even in 1937, there was this Hollywood studio strike, and there was like fist fights in the street. You know, people were going at each other with axe handles and bats and things like that. So, you know, the fact that the Disney strike was comparatively, you know, free of that kind of violence was an achievement.
Yeah. Yeah, there was, back in the 1910s and 20s, there was just a huge amount of labor violence, so.
Yeah.
So am I right that there is a bunch of cool stuff that didn't make it into the book that you have in your notes?
Yeah. I mean, there's always stuff that, you know, because you know, generally it's like when something happens, you try to get corroborating sources. You know, and sometimes and some artists in their old age will sort of, you know, gild their own performance, or they'll be inaccurate about something. So you've got to cross-reference people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, if you heard something. So and there's always some stuff where they just say, "Oh, you can't print that." I'm like, okay. Mm-hmm. you know, it's a compromise. You know, like, what was it? Alfred Hitchcock once said, "If we get half of what we ask for, we'll still be ahead."
So what part of the research was most enjoyable?
I think the first person stuff was fun. Was a lot of fun, and so certain, you know, and when you really start to uncover this backstage Hollywood stuff, that's kind of fascinating, because again, it's like showing a side of a lot of people whose careers you admired, or whose you know, reputations you cherish, and then to see this sort of different side of them, you know, is rather fascinating. Mm-hmm. And you try to imagine yourself, you know, like, what would you do, you know, that day? Like I found like the single most traumatic day was, I think it was like May 29th, 1941, mm-hmm. the first day when the picket line went up in front of the Disney studio. Mm-hmm. And even though everybody had been talking about it for months, when it finally happened, everybody was like just a little bit shocked. You know, like as you got to work in the morning, mm-hmm. you suddenly had to decide, okay, am I for Walt or am I for the Union? Mm-hmm. And it's like, you know, if, you know, this potentially could make me unemployed during the Great Depression, which, you know, now in retrospect we see the Depression was ending, mm-hmm. but at the time people weren't sure. You know, to them the Depression was still happening. Mm-hmm. So the ramifications of you know, what might happen to one's career was quite daunting, mm-hmm. and everybody had to make that choice. And I heard, you know, stories about, you know, artists like standing outside the gate for about 90 minutes arguing with each other what to do, mm-hmm. whether to cross or whether to stay out on the picket line. Mm-hmm. And I just found it kind of fascinating to hear that. You know, a lot of the people who went back to work, you know, like who you know, like in labor terms, you say they're scabbing, but the people who decided to go to work, you know, even politically, some of them were very left, whatever, like that, you know, but they just felt like they couldn't risk, you know, what might happen with their families, you know, or they some of them were worried, like, you know, if the studio goes down, you know, like if the strike might take the whole studio down, then everybody would be out of work. So there was a lot of stuff running through people's minds on that one hot summer, you know, which was a spring, you know, morning.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that stuff stayed with people the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Like one of the strike leaders, Arthur Babbitt, was the artist who created Goofy and Geppetto. And he was talking about Ward Kimball, the artist who created Jiminy Cricket. Even though Ward considered himself very progressive, James Upton Sinclair, fan and all, which today is like being a Bernie Sanders fan. So, he crossed the line and went to work. And art, like as much rancor as art had for other artists, he always pitied Ward. He said, I know it probably hurt him more than anything else. That he lived with that.
So people back then, they didn't have health insurance back then the way we do now, right?
Oh yeah, nothing. Yeah, it took forever just to get Social Security passed.
Yeah,
that was a miracle. And then the screen credits were kind of a joke. That's why it always said Walt Disney on everything, as though you imagine that Walt Disney drew everything himself. And so people don't get this kind of credit. One of the things that in my research that surprised me was how much of Hollywood up until 1941 was doing a 6-day work week. Saturday was regular time. It was not a day off. Not until 1941. The 40-hour work week was passed by Congress in 1913. Yet into the 40s, the studios were still insisting you come in on a Saturday and do at least a half day. It's like a 46-hour week. And then if you had a problem with coming in on the weekend, you would talk with Uncle Max or Uncle Walt, and he would let you work Thursday till like 11 o'clock. And so this is before overtime. Then when you're on a deadline, then you're putting in all the extra time as well. So that's the kind of thing that rankled people. And then, the studio's right to just basically fire anybody on a whim. There's a famous story about Walt Disney firing a guy who told a dirty joke. And it wasn't even directed at Walt. Walt just happened to be walking by as the two guys were talking to one another. And then he fired him. The interesting thing, the fascinating thing about Walt Disney was that he was such a control. I won't say control freak, but he was so into the image that he was creating, because there were a lot of studio heads, and your studio heads didn't act like America's watching them to see how moral they are. Nobody cares what Louis B. Mayer was doing or Harry Cohen and Columbia was doing. But Walt created this image, and it was nothing for Walt to walk up to one of his single animators and say, you've been fooling around a lot lately. You really should settle down and get married. Like, what? It's none of your business.
Yeah, that's funny.
But it was that again too. So Walt was a big fan of Henry Ford. He admired Henry Ford. And the Horatio Alger concept of you self-made man. You start with nothing and you work really hard, and then you become successful. It's that Protestant work ethic. And he had come through a lot of rough and tumble. He'd been cheated by producers. He'd been cheated by backers, robbed the personnel, plagiarized, and yet he survived this whole thing to be on top. So he really felt like, nobody's going to tell him, how to run his studio.
Now, there wasn't anything they did in animation back then that would have health effects, was there?
No, it's just overwork. You get eye strain, you get carpal tunnel, but nobody knew what carpal tunnel was yet. You get sore wrist. After a while. The business just requires many man hours, like sitting at a table. Staring into a light, and so in terms of physical, physical threat, no, it's not that kind of business. But it's just putting in the very long hours, and just doing a lot of work, and the artists by and large, were very proud of what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're very happy they're making these kind of things that children around the world love. And adults as well.
Mm-hmm.
There was the saying in the early 1930s. There was a slogan about you would go up to a theater and go, "What? No Mickey Mouse?"
What did you find that was most surprising in your research?
I was surprised that there was for a little while at one point that the mob got involved.
Mm-hmm.
There never was the sort of mafia infiltration in Hollywood the way there was in like New York and Chicago and some of the big eastern cities where the mob was like very big in city government and stuff. The mob here, it made some inroads and mainly through unions and all because basically when the first unions were starting to form in the 20s and 30s, the studios answered with muscle. They would hire vigilantes. They'd actually hire off-duty LAPD to like sort of beat up strikers,
Huh.
And so the unions felt they needed some muscle. So then they wound up, sort of like reaching for the underworld guys. And what's interesting was that the way like one of the reasons why the mob was kept out of LA so successfully was that the LAPD in a way was almost even worse. That's why you have movies like LA Confidential and things like that, where they had a group called the Hat Squad. And basically these detectives would hear through their contacts that some big mobster was coming into town, to relocate. And they would meet him at Union Station and take him up into the hills, like Mulholland Drive's on the top of the hills. And they basically work him over and throw him off a cliff.
Wow.
But they also had a group called the Red Squad, which was if there were union organizers or people complaining about segregation or civil rights or anything like that, that they would go beat them up as well. So there was this kind of rough component there, and there was a guy named Willard Byoff. His original name was Morris Biofsky, but everybody called him Willard Byoff, and he was sent out from Chicago by Frank Nitty's gang to sort of infiltrate the Hollywood unions. And a lot of Hollywood studios used him like they used Mickey Cohen because he was muscle. Mm-hmm. And he actually tried to insinuate himself into the Disney strike, which is kind of unique. Mm-hmm. Eventually, Byoff was sent to Alcatraz around 1940, and he turned government witness. Mm-hmm. And then around 1959, he was living in Arizona, and he went out to his truck in the morning, turned the key, and exploded.
Oh.
And so obviously somebody remembered, And they said that when the police, fire brigade showed up, they found his wife, Mrs. Byoff, was in a lemon tree with a ladder, and they said, "Oh, the poor woman, her mind must be broken with grief." And she says, "No, it's just Willie had a really nice diamond ring, and I think I saw that finger fly up into the tree."
That's an LA story. So, I can imagine that Walt Disney, as angry as he might have gotten, might not have wanted to go that direction with the violence, just because of the image, at a minimum, the image that he cultivated. Yeah.
There was that. It never, like I said, it never got to that level of like, again, a couple of years later, in 1945, there was a big studio strike. The animators weren't as involved in, but I kind of touch on it, what you call the War of Hollywood, which was basically two rival unions trying to control the backstage of the live action, studios, and they were like, it was like a riot, in front of the Warner Brothers studio, which was like 3,000 film workers battling the Burbank police and turning over cars, and they had to turn hoses on and whatever. Mm-hmm. So it got really insane, But there were a couple of animators, there at the time, but it didn't involve the animation world as directly because we had just gone through the big strike in 1941, and again too. World War II was happening, and during World War II there was like a labor peace where basically the American Federation of Labor and the National Association of Manufacturers had agreed that there would be no major labor actions, for the duration of the war. But by summer '45, everybody felt like, well, it's only a matter of time, before Japan's defeated. So it's time to start, talking about this stuff again.
Yeah, that Warner Brothers riot that you mentioned, I wonder if that inspired the Blazing Saddles scene.
It could be, yeah, because it wasn't in that very area, and again too, it's very funny to hear about the different people involved. Where like Peter Lorre stayed out, Bogart was quietly very liberal and everything. Bogart was a lot like Rick in Casablanca. Like he was politically liberal, and he just didn't make a big deal about it, kept it quiet. But then like one of the lead producers, his secretary was Ayn Rand, and she was like, "Oh, you got to cross. Don't let these Bolsheviks take over."
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
Was there a question or issue that was particularly difficult to come to a conclusion on, or maybe you never got a satisfactory answer about?
No, see, I think, well, I mean, there's always going to be sort of he said, she said things, like, one of the things that happened in my own time, around 1979, 1980, was there was a lead artist at Disney named Don Bluth, and Don was being groomed to be like one of the leaders of the Disney studio, but he quit the studio in '79, taking about a third of the staff with him, and formed a rival company called Don Bluth, Productions, and he made films like The Secret of Nim and American Tail and Land Before Time. He did some very popular movies, but he had given Disney the studio its first real competition in decades. Because they really didn't have like many rivals, on the big screen. Television was there's a lot of stuff on television, but Disney sort of ruled the whole game, when it came to feature films. And what's interesting about Don is that there were artists who were mad at him for leaving. And then the artists that are really very passionately in favor of him. So he has a lot of detractors and a lot of fans. Like Brad Bird, the famous current director who did the Incredibles movies and stuff. He had a falling out with Don very early on when they were trainees together. So and then there are others who are very pro. So you never really get like sort of a complete picture, because it's a lot of the opinions are changed by people's personal animosity or idealization of these people.
I always thought actors and actresses were the very emotional ones. It sounds like the animation community is pretty intense.
Yeah. Well, Robert Zemeckis called us actors with pencils. And that's pretty apt. Yeah, that's true.
Oh man, was there anything you discovered that had an emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
Let's see. I think I always kind of liked that Babbitt, who was the leader of the 41 strike, in his old age, got a very kind letter from Roy Disney. Basically after years and years of animosity, just saying, we're aware of how important you were to the studio, and how much the studio meant to you, and just basically saying thank you. And Art was really touched by this, and he kept his letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. It meant that much to him. Because of a lot of them, when they left Disney, it was sort of like a bad divorce. They're still sort of angry about things. Again, Bill Melendez, who directed Charlie Brown Christmas, when he left the studio after the 41 strike, he said, "I'm leaving Disney. My career is over." And actually, it was just beginning. because he had a very minor role at Disney's, and he did much better when he was outside, working at Warner Brothers and then for his own studio. Another one I was impressed by was during the Fleischer strike in 1937, which was a pretty big strike. There was a young cartoonist there named Jakob Kirtzberg, and he was working as a minor assistant on Betty Boop and Popeye cartoons. But he didn't really feel very satisfied by it. He felt like he wanted to do something else. And when the strike happened at Fleischer's in 1937, he got fed up and said, I'm going to follow my first love, which is I want to work in comic books. So he left the studio and changed his name to Jack Kirby. And then of course he became like the top artist at Marvel Studios and invented Hulk and the Fantastic Four and a lot of the characters that we go now to look at giant movies about. Kirby was involved with their creation.
Oh yeah. So considering the book was first published in 2006, and what has the book done, and what do you hope it will continue to do for readers?
Well, one of the things that I was very satisfied by, I really was touched, was when the families of some of the older artists who were involved in the labor scene sent me letters to say thank you for restoring my father's reputation, or thank you for pointing out all the important things that my father and mother did, for Hollywood. And that made me feel very good that I was able to restore a certain amount of, a piece of the Hollywood story that had sort of, fallen off and been forgotten. And I think there's still a message which, even though everything's digital now, there's still large groups of people who work for a weekly paycheck, and you look at these giant movies that go by, like the Avengers or Guardians of the Galaxy, and you look at those Roman legions of names going by, and think every one of those names is a career, and they have a house and a family, and they worry about retirement, they worry about healthcare just like everybody else, and you still have people in charge who make a lot of money, and a lot of other people who just work for a weekly check. And as long as that situation, there's going to be a need for something like a union, because one artist by themselves, you can't fight a corporation by yourself. But I found with the unions that a union is sort of like it's sort of like an umpire in a baseball game, or a judge or something, in a sporting event. It just keeps the playing field level and keeps everybody behaving themselves. And it's needed. People think it's not needed, but it's still very relevant today.
Yep. So you said that the book, I think you said it took about 7 years to complete.
Yeah.
Were there any issues, apart from the time it took, in finishing the book or getting it published, finding a publisher for it?
Well, I think a problem with any kind of Hollywood book is you always have a problem with image rights. And you always can have an issue of somebody's, like if I want to use a Disney still, if I want to use, images from a Disney film, I have to, clear it with a Disney company. And then, the legal departments of the various studios want to read, to make sure you're not saying anything bad about their studio. So there's a lot of oversight and a lot of scrutiny and things like that, and sometimes things get held up. And Disney's in particular is very sensitive about the image in the studio being just so. So that can take a while. And then I learned a lot of things about image rights. Like if you notice on the cover of the book, there's an illustration. If I used a photograph of Walt Disney, then I have to get permission from the Disney family and the Disney Corporation. But that is not a photograph of Walt Disney. That is a painting.
Right.
And the painting is of a man with a little mustache. And I'm not saying it's Walt Disney. You can think it's Walt Disney.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't say that.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing you have to kind of go around. Like if you create an illustration, it's different than if you actually use an image. So you have to be very careful where you're using your imagery. So like press photos. One thing that aren't around anymore. I remember Leonard Maltin told me about was lobby cards. Mm-hmm. Was that in the old days of theaters you'd have those stills, they called lobby cards.
Right.
Lobby cards were considered public domain, like newspaper.
Huh.
So you don't have to get permission to use a lobby card. But the only thing is that they don't make lobby cards about movies anymore, unfortunately.
Right.
But that was like another way to kind of like try to get imagery for your stuff. And then again, there's always like things that you want to use that you're not allowed to use, things like that. So.
And as far as getting a publisher, right? As far as getting a publisher, was there any issue there?
Yeah, because I didn't try too hard with a commercial press. I found university presses are a little more amenable to something that's more, scholarly like this. And then also, again, too, the studio legal departments aren't as critical of a university press because it's seen for educational purposes rather than exploitation. Like a couple of years ago, there was a book came out called Walt Disney: The Dark Prince, and it had a lot of negative stuff in it. A lot of just like Richard Schickel's The Disney Version in 1967 was like one of the first books that was very critical of Disney. And if you flip through those, you'll notice there's no images. So the studios are very sensitive towards, are you trying to make money by taking a hatchet to our reputation? And and basically I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to tell the story of how animation artists dealt with working conditions throughout Hollywood history. So I found that could be better done with a university press than with a commercial press.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now I see, apart from this book, you had a successful book in 2013 about digital animation, I believe.
Yes.
And do you have another writing project going on, or?
Yeah, I actually have 3 I'm working on right now. So I'm writing a history of the animation renaissance. Basically in the 80s and 90s, when animation kind of came back. Like it's like when I graduated school in 1976, the theatrical releases of feature animated films were maybe 2 a year. Mm-hmm. There'd be like the Disney film and there'd be one other one. Now for the last 10 years, it's been about 29 a year. Mm-hmm. It's about 2 a month. I think there's a Chinese film opening up today, right now. And television, there was nothing on prime time. Everything was Saturday morning cartoons. Mm-hmm. Was to deal with it. They call it the Saturday morning ghetto. As a kid, you got up around 6 to 7, got your pre-sweetened cereal, talked to some of the TV, and you watched cartoons till noon. And that was Saturday morning. Yeah. But there was nothing at night. Mm-hmm. And if you told me in 1975 that 15 years in the future, the most popular show on television is going to be a animated sitcom with a yellow kid with a jagged head, I'd say you're out of your mind.
Yeah.
Nobody saw that coming. That was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to write a bit about that. The computer animation book, Movie Innovation, was that at the end of the Union book, I talked about the digitalization of film production and how that had evolved. Like what was the source of that? Where did it come from? Mm-hmm. And I found the chapter getting bigger and bigger. And finally, one of my editors said to me, "You got a new book here." I'm like, "Oh yeah." And get you, it's a fascinating subject, because I'm not a tech person. Mm-hmm. I don't really write tech, Mm-hmm. But I found the inventors and the pioneers fascinating. Mm-hmm. In the 1960s, when you thought of computers, you thought of these like James Bond, death machines, something that Blofeld was sitting in front of, petting his cat, and there'd be these big giant computers that were going to, nuke the world.
Mm-hmm.
But there were people at that time looking at those things going, let's make art.
Mm-hmm.
Let's use these things and make cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And that just seems insane. But now it's just such an established given. Movies like The Incredibles and Toy Story and Ice Age have done so well.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I found fascinating about that when I was doing the research is that it doesn't follow on a linear track. You can't point to one Walt Disney. Like people, when they think about computer graphics, if they think at all about it, they think, well, George Lucas rubbed the lamp and John Lasseter, the Pixar popped out, and they made Toy Story.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it's like there was a multi-track thing going on where it's like the military put a lot of money in the 60s into flight simulation.
Huh.
They wanted flight simulators. So when you turn the controls of your plane, the landscape in front of you has to move in real time to your control. And in the 60s, that's a very complicated algorithm, for a computer to do. Now it's like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But then around 1980, the Microsoft Corporation had a flight simulation program that they trained pilots on, and they released it as a video game called Flight Simulator.
Mm-hmm.
And it did really well because everybody loved it. You get to fly a plane.
Yeah.
So there was the military involved, and there was academia, there was experimental filmmakers, there was motion picture visual effects people, there was all these different trends all working on separate tracks till about the late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So when things started to combine, they're sort of like plot lines in a Russian novel.
Mm-hmm.
They all started to kind of like intertwine with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So I just found all that stuff fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I've interviewed a fair number of sci-fi and fantasy artists, and the ones who are a little bit older, some of them brought up, in the late 80s and early 90s, they were sort of torn between, do I go into this digital, art stuff, or do I stick with traditional? Yeah. Like, what's going to happen? What's going on? So it's...
Right. Yeah. It is kind of fascinating. Like one great story was shortly after they had done Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Ricardo Montalban, and it had some very early computer graphics in it called the Genesis effect, which is like a first breakthrough done by a number of artists. Mm-hmm. There was a small computer graphics house that was trying to get some work out of Paramount on the next Star Trek movie. Mm-hmm. And what they did is that they took a frame of the Enterprise from the movie, and they used it to virtually build a new Enterprise. Like they built an Enterprise in virtually, in their computer, and you could turn it in any angle. And they brought the Paramount people in, and they said, look, here's the Enterprise. You could turn it. You could make it you could film it from any angle. You could stretch it. You could speed it up. You could break it into pieces. It's just a virtual Enterprise. And the producer told me they lost the contract when one of the Paramount people said, "That's beautiful. Can I hold it?" He says, "No, you can't hold it. It's not real. It's virtual." And he goes, "I want to take one home." You can't take it home. There's no such. It's virtual. It's not there. And she said, everybody looked at each other like someone had farted in the room, and they were just totally confused, and they just walked away. And they were like, "What the hell just happened?"
I've met a few people who've worked with Paramount who would not be surprised at a story like that.
I mean, one of the things she told me later, she said, my final revenge is right now I could walk out on the street, stop somebody, and say, you know what CGI is? And they go, yeah, computer graphics. Mm-hmm. He goes, in 1985, nobody knew what the hell you're talking about. Mm-hmm. It was science fiction, and the thing I find fascinating is the guy who wrote the very first software for a computer to draw lines instead of numbers. Mm-hmm. Was a fellow named Ivan Sutherland. And he's still alive. He's in his 80s. He was just giving a talk at the the last SIGGRAPH convention. But I love the fact that in one lifetime, we've gone from a few glowing lines on a screen to Avatar and all these gigantic movies, Pacific Rim, all this stuff. It's just basically in about a 50-year lifespan.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. One of my other favorite stories that I enjoyed from this was in 2001: Space Odyssey, the Kubrick film. It's a beautiful movie. I mean, when you see it on a big screen, 70 millimeter, it still holds up. You still lose yourself in it. It's gorgeous. But there's no computer graphics in it. I mean, there's filmmaking techniques there that Georges Méliès would have understood from 1909. It's very traditional filmmaking. It was just done so well that you don't notice. There's one scene where the HAL computer is telling the two astronauts that the satellite dish on the Discovery is going to fail, and you need to go out and take a look. And as they're looking down at the screen, there's a wireframe of the satellite dish turning 360, and it's a perfect, vector image, of a wireframe construct of the satellite dish. The way that was done was, it really is made out of wire. a miniature guy, a guy who's skilled in miniatures, made sculpted a satellite dish out of chicken wire, sprayed it white, put it on a record turntable, mounted a horizontal still camera, and turned it incrementally while taking photographs. And then they took all the photographs and shot them under an animation, rostrum camera, and then put in video distortion, and then that was matted onto the screen. And when you look at it, it looks like a computer, but it's completely fake.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So so your books are found on Amazon.
Yes.
Can people find, do you do any kind of writing or social media stuff that people can maybe follow you?
Yeah, I blog around, and I have my own site, and I also have I write periodically for Animation World Network, AWN.com, and Animation Magazine. Actually, the book that I'm working on now, that's also due next spring, is just kind of a crazy thing. I'm writing a cookbook. It's kind of weird, because when I started my career as an assistant, I got to assist Grim Natwick. And Grim Natwick was the animator who created Betty Boop. And he also was the lead animator on Snow White. And he was an octogenarian and all. But Grim was originally from Missouri, and he was very proud of his own personal chili recipe. So I had Grim Natwick's chili recipe. And then I found out Walt Disney had a chili recipe. And then I found out the Japanese director Miyazaki likes to cook ramen for his crew. Then Bill Hanna of Hanna-Barbera used to like to make barbecue for his team. So I was talking with my publisher, and I said, I think I could do a cookbook. And they're like, that's a great idea. So it's going to be called Eat, Drink, Animate. And I've got about 80 recipes now. I've got like 10 Oscar winners and about 5 Oscar nominees. And it's just personal recipes, and it's funny because it's everything from, I've got 3 people who are actual chefs, who actually, left the film business and became cooks. And so I have gourmet recipes, and then I have simple things like there was a director who did death metal videos, and he had a recipe for whiskey and pickle juice. So you take a shot of rye and then a shot of pickle juice.
Yeah, I could see that. That book would be very popular. I can see that.
Yeah,
I can see it already.
I think everything. It's fun. It's a lot of people are just having fun with it. I just got a recipe from Michael Giacchino. It's the Oscar-winning composer, of from Avengers 2 and a bunch of other films. So it's fun that people are all just jumping in and volunteering their recipes. So that'll be out next spring.
Okay. Now, what's your website? You said you have a website?
Yeah, it's just TomSito.com.
Okay, so that's TOMSITO.com.
Yes.
All right. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think animation. It's a fascinating business. I mean, it's been a career for me, and it's funny how it's it comes from the Latin animas, to give life, and it is funny that like we kind of dedicate ourselves to create this sort of synthetic people, a character like Bart Simpson. Bart Simpson is not just the writer, James L. Brooks. It's not just the director, David Silverman. It's not the designer, Matt Groening. It's not the voice, Nancy Cartwright. He's all of those people. He creates Bart Simpson. Just like Bugs Bunny or Ariel the Little Mermaid is alive in our minds. We know who she is or he is. Sometimes we know them better than our own brother or sister. But it's an artificial construct. And when you can participate in something like that and be in on the creation of that type of character that endears itself to people, it's an amazing feeling. It's really very exciting. And to just sort of shed a little light on the incredibly creative men and women who do this day by day and everything is a privilege that I've been able to do, and I'm very grateful for it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. One of the best ways in which you can provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you like this, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't, and I'll use that feedback to hopefully make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. You can also get more information on my website, chrisalvarez.com. Please remember my name Chris does not have an H, so it's ChrisAlvarez.com. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the future.